Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Shevchenko Scientific Society. My name is Pavlo Bandera. I am an operations manager here at the Society. We're grateful that you could all attend tonight's event for the launch of Adrian Karatnyczky's new and timely book, Battleground, Ukraine, From Independence to the War with Russia. Before we begin, we'd like to remind you that our Society routinely hosts online and in-person events. We have nothing currently scheduled for the rest of this month, but make sure to check regularly on our website, shevchenko.org, and on our social media pages to find out what's coming up next. We also recommend subscribing to our newsletter for regular programming updates and encourage you to sign up and become a member of the Society. Our guest author tonight, Adrian Karatnycky, is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and co-director of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. Through the Council's Ukraine program, as a labor union official and as CEO of Freedom House, he has been deeply engaged in Ukraine for over 3 decades. He has written about Ukraine for leading newspapers and journals, including the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy, where he is a regular commentator. Our moderator tonight is Alexander Motyl, professor of political science and deputy director of the Division of Global Affairs at Rutgers University. He is noted for his public writings on contemporary politics in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, along with theoretical explorations of nationalism, empire, and revolution. Over the past 2.5 decades, he has written 6 books of nonfiction and contributed dozens of articles to academic and policy journals, newspaper, op-ed pages, and magazines. Motyl is also active as a poet, writer of fiction, and visual artist. We'll have a Q&A session after the talk, time permitting. With that, please give a round of applause for Adrian Karatnycky and Alexander Motyl.
Good evening, just a brief correction. I am not the Associate Director of the Division of Global Affairs, or at least I haven't been since 1999. That's quite all right. Anyway, what we're going to do today, as you can see, we're holding the session in English. Later on, when you have questions or comments, I'm sure you can, if you prefer, you can make them in Ukrainian, and then Adrian will respond either way, depending. We'll both respond, well, whichever way happens to be most convenient. The format is very simple. Adrian will speak for about 10 minutes, maybe a little more, about the book itself. And then we will gradually shift to a discussion of the elections that just transpired and what they all mean for Ukraine. I'm sure I'm sure you're here to get the book and listen to the author, but it would be a gross disappointment if we didn't talk about this earth-shattering or potentially earth-shattering event. And I think your comments and questions, your own views on what the elections mean or don't mean for Ukraine will be of interest as well. So we can have something in the nature of a discussion between Adrian and me, but of course you're more than welcome to participate in that exchange as well. So without any further ado, Adrian.
I'll start my remarks from here, and then we'll just have a back and forth at the dais or whatever it is, whatever at the table. So I've written what is the first history of the modern Ukrainian state. There is no similar text, so it tells the history of Ukraine from the origins of the protest movements and ferment in the late 80s through the establishment of the state, through the beginning of 2014 and the full-scale, 2024 rather, and the full-scale war. The book is organized around presidencies. It tries to tell a story within the framework of the kinds of tensions that have and forces that have helped shape Ukraine and the Ukrainian people over the last 3 decades. And it puts forward a kind of a thesis that Ukraine has preserved its pluralism and its relative institutional openness, partly because of the interplay of the influence of the East and the West, the tensions between oligarchy, civil society, and I would say the new emerging real private sector economy, rather than the economy built on thievery of state assets, and it also tries to make the case that Ukraine, in the end, is a heterarchy where there isn't a settled relationship between state institutions. There is a shifting ebb and flow of influence between the presidency, the parliament, to a lesser extent the courts, but also between the various elements of society. So at certain moments, the driving force in Ukraine is the street, is the Maidan. We see that at several notable moments in Ukrainian history, which I don't need to repeat. They're really quite well known. At some times there is the preeminence of a strong president, or a president that wants to exercise unchecked power or almost unchecked power, and that effort always meets with failure. It fails when Kuchma tries to revise the constitution to really create a Russian model, or a traditional post-Soviet model of the strongman presidency, and his efforts at constitutional reform fail, as do his efforts to figure out a way to extend his term in office into a third term. It fails when Yanukovych in 2012 tries to create a constitutional majority in the parliament, again to ram through kind of that that post-Soviet model, that kind of Putin model. He fails for interesting reasons, not just because of the opposition of civil society and of the political opposition, which, despite some of the authoritarian tendencies of Yanukovych, nevertheless exists, is vigorous, and is strong. But it also, he meets up with the resistance of the oligarchy. And the oligarchy is angry at his rapid enrichment through corruption and through basically shakedowns of the oligarchic elite. And they create the circumstances with media and with resources to prevent his party from getting even I would say, a stable working majority. In other words, they fight to ensure that not only is there no constitutional majority for the party of regions and its allies, but also that the parliament that comes into being is beholden in part to them. And this is a very different model that from what occurred in Russia. And of course, the oligarchs are relatively untamed even under Yanukovych. They're unhappy with him. They worry about his excessive attempts at the concentration of power, but he fails in this effort to change that kind of a heterarchic model of Ukraine. The book is organized around the presidencies. Even it's really the easiest way, given the proliferation of prime ministers and of different macro and micro events. I think it was the only organizing principle that worked. It deals with the 6.1 presidents, because there is a little bit of a bow to Turchinov, who served as acting president after Yanukovych's flight from Kyiv. There are, however, 2 chapters devoted to Zelensky. Zelensky, the president before the full-scale war, and the country under a Zelensky president at a time of an all-out full-scale war. the book was, the book had a period of gestation. Originally, I was pushing to get it out for the 30th anniversary of Ukrainian independence. A fire and COVID kind of delayed my plans, but in a sense, it was helpful, partly because, I had the leitmotif of the Ukrainian-Russian relationship running throughout, but I had to re-examine it from the point of view of, Kremlin ambitions and so on, and to take a much harder look at the various singular events in Ukrainian history, all of the conflicts that occurred early on around the autonomy of Crimea and Russian meddling at the earliest stages. I have an anecdote of a conversation that I have with Boris Tarasyuk. We're walking out of the foreign ministry in the in the late aughts. I'd have to check to remember the year. And I had just seen him. He was rushing to get into a car. Before he gets into a car, he pivots and points to the foreign ministry building, and he says, "You may think this is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but this is really primarily the Ministry of Russian Relations, because in every country, all of our diplomats constantly have to fight against Russian efforts to undermine us, Russian efforts to cast a different narrative, to undermine the fact that we are a permanent, stable, and independent state." So even then you feel this kind of tension. We have the tension over the Kerch Straits, and of course we have, with the advent of Putin, we have the rise of a different attitude to Ukraine, the constant messages to Western leaders that this is not a real state, that this is a failed state, that it should not exist, the laments over the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so forth. So all these things are also interwoven into the text. I do have a very specific view of the Yanukovych flight, and I believe, and I've argued it more cogently and in greater detail in a foreign policy piece, that the Maidan was the circumstance that removed Yanukovych from power, but that it was also the decision by Putin to withdraw support for him that led to the chain of events that forced his flight, and that Russia had in place the plan for the Ruskaya Vesna, the Russian Spring, and for the immediate annexation of Crimea, and that this plan had been in the works even under the Yanukovych period, especially in the period when Yanukovych was having discussions about a free trade treaty and deeper integration into Europe, from which he, of course, pivoted, provoking the Maidan. But anyway, the book was so the book is a kind of a story of the. Well, let me put it another way. Many of us here are Americans. Many of us grew up in this country, and we cannot be struck by the fact that the period 1991 to 2024 is a roughly 3.5 decades. Is roughly the period from 1776 to the War of 1812, and what I am writing about is the Ukrainian, I wouldn't call them equivalents, but the Ukrainian coevals in terms of of a period of Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington. The Ukrainian leaders, in the early stages at least, don't measure up. They don't measure up partly because, in a sense, the revolution from below, this spurt towards independence, which is partly led by the street and by the fear of the elite of the people and of the rage of the people at the time of the putsch and in the immediate aftermath. But it is in a sense, I wouldn't call it hijacked, but it is taken over by this in fact, Red directors and the Communist Party elite, and then maybe the next wave is the kind of the Komsomol generation that comes into economic and eventually political power. And these are people without a great sense of national purpose. I think they see opportunity in the state as a kind of both a cash cow and a source of prestige and power, but they lack the vision of constructing a unified Ukrainian state. So the book kind of tells the story of how Ukraine, which is first divided along this, southwest to southwest to northeast axis between what we would call the, kind of the pro-Russian or Russophone Ukraine and culturally Ukrainian and more nationally conscious Ukraine. But this gradually erodes, and it erodes because there is an idea, and that idea is rooted in, if you examine the early documents of the national democratic movement of the Ruch and of the civic forces that led the pressure to create a Ukrainian state, although they failed to take the commanding heights of that state. Nevertheless, those values that you see in the first Ruch congresses are roughly the values by which Ukraine is governed today. A Ukrainian, a culturally Ukrainian state open to national minorities, committed to democratic values and a kind of gradualism, and that is all latent in the early, in the early DNA of the people who were advancing the idea of Ukrainian independence. And so happily, Ukraine comes to the right point, and I think we don't have to have a discussion about this, but by 2014, the 20 years of statehood and identification with Ukraine, and even with a failed leadership, but also to some extent through the influence of people like the Yushchenko presidency, which raises the idea of the Ukrainianness of the Ukrainian state to a higher level than his predecessors. All of that contributes to a gradual coming together, and the great shock of the annexation of Ukraine and the troubles that Ukrainians in the East themselves feel with the rise of these Russian-supported and Russian criminal organizations that take over Luhansk and Donetsk regions. All that leads to a consolidation of the people that deepens over the course of those 8 years before February 2022. So Ukrainians and the Ukrainian state comes together, the Ukrainian state shows resilience and so on. So I'll conclude that, and I just want to make one kind of I'll conclude that. So this is a story of how the Ukrainian state comes together, how it develops the kind of resilience that enables it to show so much effectiveness and solidarity and consolidation in the face of the Russian invader. And maybe we'll move on to a bit of a discussion, and I'll hand over the microphone to Alex. And of course, I can return to the book in your own if you have any further questions.
Thank you, Adrian, for that excellent presentation. Let's start with a question, my question to you. Here we have your book. Were Zelensky, Putin, and especially Donald Trump, were they to read your book? What would they learn? What would they learn that they don't know or haven't thought about?
Well, I mean, each of them would learn something very, very different. We'll start with Zelensky. I think what Zelensky would learn is that he's not the only guy who did things to help build the state. That for all of his failings, Poroshenko achieved a great deal. And of course, you can't say that in an election when you're running against him and you develop a kind of a personal antipathy for the guy. But I think he would learn that he inherited some important steps forward from the predecessors whose advice and counsel he has rejected to this very day. He would also learn that there were people like Yushchenko, I don't know what he thought about him, but who were the bearers of Ukrainian identity, who created some of the cultural commemorations and so on. So I think there's something to learn. And he'd also learned that he had no idea, well, we know that he had very little idea of what Ukrainian culture and civilization was when he came to the presidency, but I think he's caught up in the last couple of years, so maybe he doesn't have to learn that much about that. In terms of what Putin would learn, I think Putin wouldn't learn anything. I think what he would learn is there's an accurate description of what his intentions were to Ukraine, what the origins of that are, including his relationship with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who basically had the idea that Galicia is Ukraine, everything else is Malorossiya, and that everything else is not a part of the Russian people. We make an exception for the kind of the Greek Catholics and the people in primarily in the Galician outposts, and that is a driving idea inside Putin's mind, and that maybe drove into the illusion that the Ukrainian people would welcome the fraternal Russian brothers coming to rescue them from God knows what. Anyway, and in terms of Trump, and I think in terms of the people who will advise Trump, I think what they might need to learn is that Ukraine has a very dynamic society and a very independent society. And it also has a highly mobilized cadre of people who've risked their blood, sweat, and their very lives to fight for the country. And that I don't think you can make an agreement without factoring in public opinion. This is not a place, Ukraine is not a place where the big leaders can sit together and simply make decisions. And that President Zelensky has to take into account these various forces. And President Trump will have to, and his advisors will have to take into account these forces, because it's not just a question of settling the borders and arranging a ceasefire and making whatever arrangements are necessary. But these have to be the kind of arrangements that won't plunge Ukraine into political turmoil. There are some seats up front if you guys want to come in. There's a little bit of room here and there. There's one over there. You're welcome to come in. So I think that is, I think, the most fundamental thing, that the Ukrainian people are a highly civically active people. They didn't seem like that 15 or 20 years ago, but 30 years of a state that doesn't, I have a theory about why Ukrainians are so active and how they can get together and organize voluntary activities. And that is because they did it all the time. You have a little square or playground for your children. Suddenly a wall appears and someone's trying to dig a hole in it and build a building that will block out the little park that you took your children to. People mobilize. Or there's an old historic building and someone wants to tear it down. Ukrainians organize to try to stop it or to try to reverse it. They sometimes succeed, they sometimes fail. But then the next time some pipes break and they need to force the government to provide public services, they mobilize. So it's not like permanent structured organizations, but it is the habits of many years of people coming together in, kind of effective short-term communities to solve tasks. And that was precisely what happened at the beginning of the war, when people were able to use those kinds of skills and their mutual trust to create voluntary efforts to support the war, to support the people on the front. Of course, we know that drone warfare and the revolution in warfare that Ukraine has brought, I mean, it's a temporary revolution. In 5 or 10 years, they'll figure out a way how to, disrupt drones with electronic warfare. But for the next years, this was all created by by the state, by the Ukrainian state. It was created by an open leadership in the Ukrainian military that was ready to take whatever help they could get, but it was created by just people doing stuff. So my basic point is you have to understand all these things, that people are heavily invested in this war. They're not going to be just passive, that let the big boys do this. There will, and so a real understanding of where the art of where Ukraine can compromise, and not just the government of Ukraine or the leaders of Ukraine, will be extremely important. And I hope that the people congealing around Trump in terms of foreign policy don't miss that dimension of their diplomacy.
Thank you. I mean, if there's one thing that I'm certain of, is that they'll miss that dimension. I mean, given the level of ignorance within the Washington establishment and within that particular sector of the Washington establishment, I would be shocked if they suddenly declared, oh my God, there's a Ukrainian civil society. But that said, let me play devil's advocate, because you raised a very important point, regardless of my own skepticism here. So the big boys get together, and basically we're talking about Putin and Trump, and maybe Zelensky's brought in to bring in the coffee or things like that, right? And they make a deal, and the deal is whatever it happens to be. There's protest on the streets of Ukraine. We're talking about hundreds and thousands possibly marching and protesting. Turmoil, chaos. Putin is delighted. He escalates the war, knowing that the internal front is crumbling. Trump says, I told you these guys are crazy, and washes his hands of the matter and walks away.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why one hopes they will be more attentive to what the art of the possible, the art of the deal, so to speak. Because the art of the deal isn't just between Putin and Trump. The art of the deal has to be, if it's not with Zelensky, it's with Ukraine, in a sense. I think if they make that mistake, Trump will be put in a difficult position, because he will be seen to have contributed to the collapse of a country. And here I think it's another point of the book, and I want to make it more explicitly than it's made in the book. We are living at the apogee of Ukrainian life. At no time in Ukrainian history has there been so much consolidation with an understanding of the aim of Ukrainian statehood, its preservation. Never has there been such an explosion of cultural products, of books, of films, of art, as there has been particularly over the last decade, but maybe you could even argue over the last 15 to 20 years. And this has created, and also there has been not just a professional military engaged in a war, but an entire society engaged in a war. So you have to have an understanding of what Putin's rule will mean. When there was, a few tens of thousands of people who fought in the UPA, and maybe a few tens of thousands of families that supported them, and the Soviets came to occupy Western Ukraine, it was a relatively easy task, not completely easy, to root out these people, imprison many of them, send them off to Kazakhstan for, forced labor and for resettlement, and to deny them life there, and then to just take over institutions, because there were no extensive Ukrainian institutions, they were extensive Polish institutions. Here you have everything around you, and everyone around you is invested in the project of the Ukrainian state. They've been supporting the war, their children have been going to war, their husbands have been going. There is a huge investment, and to suppress it will require a totalitarian state. So it may be that they'll just blow it. I think that administration, maybe Trump can try to fob it off, but the administration would have a hard time explaining what will be occurring in the aftermath. And it would be looked upon as a loss, as a failure of diplomacy, and then as a kind of a betrayal, in the same way that he regards, it would be, he's very critical of the Afghan collapse and the way the exit was negotiated, even though he was the one who kind of negotiated the terms. Nevertheless, he didn't like the way it ended. It ended in chaos, but it only ended with like tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 people leaving. With Ukraine, you're going to have this streaming wave upon wave, a renewal of the refugee crisis, all these people filtering into Europe, creating great disruptions among our principal allies in the future standoff with not just Russia, but China and so on. So I think it would create an image of failure. And I think he doesn't want to fail. So he will want to have a solution that it may not be to Ukraine's liking, but it has to look stable and pretty durable. It can't collapse within a year or two. I think he will try. But again, this is all very speculative, and I think we should have a conversation about what will be the signals of which way he is going. And that part of that will be the kinds of people he puts around him, and the people who are in the mix for state, national security, defense, CIA, etc.
We'll come back to that in a second, but let me just be devil's advocate to my own devil's advocate. I mean, those of you who've been reading my things will know that I'm actually rather more optimistic than I am pessimistic. And my own view personally is, you used the word, you referred to the potential for Ukraine's collapse, again, theoretically. I just don't see that, honestly. I think Ukraine is winning at the moment. If your opponent is losing 1,500 soldiers a day, there's just no way that you can paint that as a victory. They've captured something like 0.5% of Ukraine's territory over the last 10 months. 0.5%. At the rate they're going, it will take them 200 years to capture all of Ukraine. We need to keep these things in perspective. You look at a map, a deep state map, and you see all those little bulges, and suddenly it looks like they're on the march. You look at a different size dimension map, and you can't see the differences. I mean, they're essentially 0.5 millimeter at the very most. Anyway, the Russian economy is a mess. According to Russian economists, serious Russian economists, 2025 will be a crunch time period for the Russian economy. Inflation is out of control. Lending rate is at 21%. Putin is spending hand over fist in the defense sector and neglecting everything else. That is simply unsustainable. Now, this isn't to say that the Ukrainian economy is doing all that well, but it is to say that one needs to remember that for all of Ukraine's problems, and there, of course, are many, and we tend to focus on them, the problems facing Russia are arguably worse. Zelensky actually enjoys a fair amount of support. Putin is openly criticized by his own officials, and he's openly criticized by the military bloggers who probably represent the common man and woman in Russia. In any case, my point is that I don't see a collapse today. And frankly, I wonder if in the case of a kind of, the big boys come together and they come up with a solution of some sort. I'm not sure that Ukraine would necessarily collapse under those circumstances either. I don't know if it would be able to engage in an offensive. I don't know whether it would be able to regain the territories it's lost thus far. The loss of territories might accelerate a bit, but I'm not sure it would be more than just a bit. Now it's 0.5%. It will be 0.6%. I'm not exactly sure if that's something to write home about or worry about excessively. Anyway, the point of this is partly just to engage in some rhetorical statements here, but more importantly, do you think Trump, Zelensky, and last but not least Putin appreciate this as well, that Ukraine is not quite the failed state that Putin claims it is? I'm not sure whether he believes it, but he certainly claims to believe it. Does Trump believe it?
I think there is a lot of disinformation in Trump world. One of the most disturbing things about the election cycle was the appearance of people like J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. In what appeared to be the inner circle. But it seems that was kind of more theatrical when, you know, the big boys are coming in and it's a different group of big boys. And I was mentioning to Alex that the leading candidate for Secretary of Defense is a gentleman named, I think, Besant, and he was, until 2015, the manager of Soros Fund Management. So, you know, if you know all the rhetoric about the evil George Soros, but when it comes to practical things, you know, the guy who did a big fundraiser for Trump raised 50 million for his campaign in 2016 and again now. So he scored some points after he left Soros, but nevertheless, this is not as ideological. You know, this guy is just a, you know, a deal maker. You know, I think it's a. I don't think there's a fixed ideology. I think he wants to end wars primarily because he wants to concentrate A, on the China threat, or B, on the you know, the rebuilding of the United States and of further growth of the economy. So I think that's at work there. But I think the other, we haven't talked about the other scenario is, we've talked about the scenario where there's a deal to be made and how hard it might be from the Ukrainian side. But to me, as you have pointed out in your writings and elsewhere, that Putin himself may want something that is unacceptable to Trump. It would look like a complete capitulation and that everyone would know it. And I think if Putin rejects what Trump believes is a reasonable offer, I think he will go ballistic. And I don't mean the launch a nuclear strike, but just in the metaphorical sense. But I think there are a number of ways of compelling Russia to agree to settle some kind of a peace, or at least a long-term a ceasefire and separation of the warring parties. And I think there are two elements. One is that Russia has to know that there are heavy Western resources available. And here I see something that is very Trumpian. There is, as you know, $300 billion of Russian money sitting, most of it in a Brussels bank. This is the ideal way of financing the war for a guy who doesn't want to spend US money. Just to go to the Europeans and say, take that money, put it to work to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. Take that money, it's Russian money, and buy weapons from the United States. We'll be happy to sell them. And I think that is what is the most likely outcome of a failed negotiation, that he will not want to spend his money, but will press the Europeans to take those resources. I spoke with a serious former Biden official about the question of getting at these resources, this money. And this person responded by saying, well, you know, it'll take a while to get the president around this issue. It'll take a while for him to socialize this with the Europeans, and to gradually, it'll be a long process. And then this person joked, on the other hand, if Trump gets elected, this was months ago, it could happen in a week. In other words, he will say, no more from us, you got to pay for it. You got this money there, go for it. Don't expect us to be writing checks anymore, and you don't have to write all those checks. You write some of them, but you can take them. And it also fits the psychology of, like, which he failed to do, which was he claimed that he was going to get the Mexicans to pay for the wall. That didn't happen, but he actually has an opportunity to get the metaphorical Mexicans to pay for the war. So I think there are other options if we go to plan B, which is the failure of his diplomacy. And I think he wants an early response. And if Putin strings him along, or if Putin, you know, demands things that are unacceptable or are very far from the kind of things that have already been signaled by the people around Trump, these plans that they have, which include some concessions to Russia, including the 20-year moratorium on Ukraine's entry into NATO, which is a very serious concession, I believe, to Putin. That could trigger the rage of Donald Trump, and that could be very helpful to Ukraine.
I just wanted to add my 2 cents to the point you made about Putin's very likely rejection of whatever terms Trump proposes. I'm struck by the fact that when one listens to these plans or reads about these plans, freezing the battlefront, making certain concessions a little to the left, a little to the right, all of them ignore the very basic fact that as of about a year and a half ago, Russia officially annexed all of Luhansk, all of Donetsk, all of Kherson, and all of Zaporizhia. So technically, according to the Russian logic, it's Ukraine that is occupying Russia and not Russia that is occupying Ukraine. What that means is that if you freeze the border along the current battlefront, effectively Putin would be granting parts of Russia to Ukraine. And this isn't even, we're not even talking about Kursk Oblast, which at this point in time is more or less firmly in Ukrainian hands and is likely to remain there for a while. I just don't see how Putin can possibly agree to any of this. There's just no way that you can paint this as a victory. Maybe if you throw in NATO, maybe. That might make a bit of a difference, but fundamentally there's fundamentally Putin has staked his entire reputation with an elite. Forget the population, Russians don't matter, it's the elite that matters. He's staked his reputation, he's made promises to make Russia great again, and instead, he's just gotten bits and pieces of 4 provinces that are devastated. In the meantime, having lost 700,000 soldiers. We keep on saying, well, the Russians don't care, they can lose millions. Well, sure they can. But at some point, even Russians will say, well, wait a second, this may just be 1 million too many. So he's treading on difficult terrain. And I'm not sure that he can actually accede to whatever demands Trump will make, which means that following the logic of your argument, Trump is likely to go to ballistic. I just don't see what alternative there is.
Well, there is Putin, and I think there's Putin, and then there's the collective Putin. And I assume that within his circle, there are people who will tell him what are the long-range consequences of Russia falling further behind in growth, and what are the consequences to Russian growth. So, I always make the point that, people sort of say, oh, sanctions, they don't work, and et cetera, et cetera. And even, wartime production and wartime GDP does not mean the same thing, because if you produce tanks that are going to be destroyed and missiles that are going to be destroyed, even though it shows up that you produced all this stuff, it's no longer on your ledger. It's not cumulatively improving living standards. And if you tilt Russian growth by 1.5%, which is probably a modest estimate of the cost of the war, in 45 years, the Russian economy in Russia will be half as big as an economy if it weren't. So over time, this failure, this economic cost has to be assessed. And we know that the reason we got glasnost and we got the collapse of the Soviet Union was partly the fear of falling behind in a pretty conservative, ossified Soviet elite. And it was the guys from the KGB who kind of knew what was up. It was guys like Andropov who kind of knew we got to do something. And I think that's why they they made a mistake in pulling up Gorbachev from obscurity and giving him this, preeminent place that allowed him to take power. One last thing, which is Russian public opinion. We know it's against Russian law to criticize the war, effort. So the Levada Institute decided to ask a different question rather than do you support the war, don't support the war. And they asked, imagine if there were resources in the Russian budget that could be, how should the resources of the Russian budget could be allocated above all? And nationwide, only 14% said to support the military sphere. 17% said education, 30% said healthcare, 30% had pensions and wages. And even in Kurska, Belgorodska, and Bryanska Oblast, only 30% of the people said, give us more money for the military, the people who are being attacked on a day-to-day basis. So I think that's a kind of an indirect signal that the public is disaffected. Now, of course, public opinion doesn't mean what it means in Ukraine. Nevertheless, I think you can't, if only 14% of the people think that it is the priority to devote more money to the war effort, that's telling you something that the Russian people are also tired of this. And that creates, I think, over the long term, internal political risk for the Russian leadership. So, I'm not saying that is going to influence Putin in the short term, but I'm not sure that, like you said, because of the death rates and because of the long term consequences, that I don't think he's going to be able to do this for the next decade and just try to wear the Ukrainians and the West down. And I think that we heard what Trump once said, but Trump has said so many things about Ukraine. But one time he did say that we're going to try to make a deal. If you don't do it, we're going to give Ukraine the resources to end this quickly. We just want this to end quickly, and it's got to end either by a deal. We're not going to let any allegedly announce this in his conversation where, with Zelensky, that we'll have your back, so to speak. So, but again, we're going to see on the personnel. That's when we see the appointments. If Secretary Pompeo is the former state secretary becomes the Secretary of Defense, that's a good sign. If Robert O'Brien becomes National Security Advisor or Secretary of State, that's a good sign. If J.D. Vance is not a part of any of these discussions, that's a good sign. And if even Richard Grenell, all these people who want to force some kind of a deal, but not capitulation, that will be a good sign.
Let me just ask one final micro question, and then we'll open it up. I was actually intending to do so, but your comments sparked this. Just recently, Zelensky had a phone call conversation with with Trump and Elon Musk. How do you interpret this? I mean, you have far more insider information than any of us. What's your sense of what Musk's participation in this means?
I think we all know that Donald Trump doesn't read a lot, doesn't know a lot. I mean, he has great instincts, and he's obviously clearly a very effective political operative and kind of a unique force in American politics, an intuitive guy. On the other hand, I think his knowledge base is, I think he's been sold on the idea that we are on the edge of a great leap forward if we unleash, the tech sector and the AI sector and so on. And he doesn't want to be encumbered by other conflicts, because I think he feels that the great era of prosperity in the United States is around the corner, and he likes it. Plus, he respects people who are more wealthy than he is. And the people around him are much more wealthy than he is. And Elon Musk is on an order of magnitude that Trump used to respect generals and used to respect. He found they weren't loyal. He may find that these guys aren't loyal because they have their own opinions. But I have to say something about, we are in an oligarchic era in the United States where these, multi-billionaires are taking a bigger role in our politics. Some of them were somewhat active in the Democratic side, like George Soros, who devoted so much money to, but mainly to civic political initiatives. But now we have this huge, newly wealthy people whose wealth is just going to continue to rise because of the amazing things that the next 15 or 20 years are going to offer. And I think the ego of Trump makes him, I think he's just fascinated by what Elon Musk has to say. And I think if you have never heard Elon Musk speak about the world of the future, I urge you to go on YouTube and see his conferences and discussions. It's really, I mean, and he's proven that he can deliver. But you know, so I think Trump wants to be, his ego is, I'm the guy who's going to create this great wave of prosperity. I don't want to be encumbered by this other stuff. But the problem with all these guys is that they don't understand the political forces, and will they listen to expertise? And like the oligarchs in Ukraine, who used to run Ukraine and have been pulled back because of the politics of Zelensky's surprising victory and consolidation of power, and his turning on the oligarchs that had backed him. You know, it's the United States that now has these big shots calling the shots, and I think they want this stuff out of the way. They're worried about China to an extent, but so is this administration. So I think that's what's driving this desire to kind of get this problem out of the way and move beyond it. But solving the problem, there are two paths to solving the problem. But to answer your question, why is Elon Musk there? Because he's just fascinated by this guy, by his wealth, by the vision that he sees of the future. And so he's gotten to know him on the campaign trail. This guy's just spinning. Trump loves to talk. So he's talking to a great talker. But this talker is not just pie in the sky. He's really created, he's one of the 5 people who are creating the world of the future. You know, Elon Musk will guarantee that in some of your lifetimes, there will be colonies, on Mars. It's just going to happen. There will be, in 5 years, people will not be driving cars. They will be, run by AI. They will be 10 times safer than human driving, saving, as he likes to say, hundreds of thousands of lives. So,
and Starlink.
Well, Starlink is a little piece of what he's doing. What he's doing. No, he did promise a continued support for for Starlink. Of course, he is. There are some of these people who believe that Ukraine is manipulating, and I think Trump and maybe Musk believes that the Ukrainians are manipulating the West into giving them money and aid, and they would prefer to just get this resolved. But when they see that you can't make a deal with Putin, I think they will not they won't be surrendering. They'll have to pivot. But why was he there? Because I think he's a great talker, and he's introduced Trump to a world of your imagination.
Okay, thank you. Let's open it up to the audience. So I see Max, Al, and then we'll come to the 2 gentlemen in the front. We only have people on this side of the room, no one on the left side. Are these reflective of your political convictions?
Maybe I can just express my question without the microphone, or even it's a comment mostly. We're here to discuss Adrian's book, and we've quickly moved into a realm where we're discussing the post-election period and who will be in the administration and how the administration will position itself towards Ukraine. In discussion with Adrian, yesterday I was mentioning to him, I'd like to get people to read the books, and I'd like to disseminate information about Ukraine. I think the book has great information about Ukraine. So let's bring those two things together and say, who in the administration, we already know what the list of candidates are for every agency. There's at least 4. To whom should we be sending the book, and how should we engage them in discussion about the materials in this book?
Well, I mean, I think that what we're talking about is something that someone had earlier asked, which was, what should the diaspora be doing? And I think it is more of an idea of trying to find channels of information to some of these key decision makers. And that can be in the form of books. It could be in the form of me bringing 2 or 3 people to have a conversation with some of these people, but to create an environment, because frankly, a lot of people have been alienated. A lot of friends of Ukraine have been alienated by some of the political decisions around the campaign and some of Trump's comments, and there isn't a kind of a relationship that has been built. So those Ukrainians that are, big time Republican donors, they should open the door to a dialogue with, experts from think tanks, from the academic community, suggest some things to read. I think it's also important, as these plans are rolled out, to have panel discussions. And so, like Pompeo, he becomes the defense secretary. The Hudson Institute is where he is a distinguished fellow. That might be a place to convene a conference. Some of the Republican think tanks, even the.
Or I should just be in the audience and say, listen, I got a copy of Adrian's book. You should be reading it right now.
Yeah, no.
I'm sorry.
No. I mean, but it's not just. I think there is a data set and information that should reach some of these people. It also means, I think, maybe, trying to get reviews in what would be called like this fringe media and these alternative sources, which are actually bigger than many of them. I don't think Tucker Carlson will do a discussion of this book, nor invite anybody who's on this panel. But I think short of that, I think the advocates for Ukraine in the diaspora and in the NGO world should try to find these forums and so on to help contribute to raising questions that should be in the heads of some of these people. I'm sure that some of them are thinking about these things. Certainly Pompeo is very occulted, and he's been to Ukraine a number of times recently, and in his past role. Others like Richard Grenell was involved in the politics of Ukraine in the previous, before the perfect phone call and all that sort of stuff. So I think these people know something, but look, we have the same problem with this administration. I'm sure that Jake Sullivan doesn't share the views of the two of us on what is possible, et cetera, and what should be done for Ukraine. So it's a perennial issue of how you get to these people. I think these people will be harder to get to, but there are people who care about Ukraine. So, for example, Alex Karp, the genius behind Palantir. Ukraine is a major consumer of Palantir technology and Palantir software. And he could be a point of communication because he co-invested with Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is hostile to Ukraine, but then there's Elon Musk has a relationship with Giorgia Meloni. The Atlantic Council, where I work, had a dinner where it was commented, this love fest between Giorgia Meloni, who strongly supports Ukraine, and Elon Musk. So I think there are ways of not just getting this information out, but triangulating and figuring out ways of kind of influence.
This information is what's important.
Well,
it's your book. That's why we're here.
No, I understand,
sorry,
but the idea that the book is somehow the key to, shaping policy. I mean, look, the point is, I think the book, as the Grandmaster Hans Niemann, the arrogant young chess player, says, the chess speaks for itself. So the book speaks for itself. I kind of outlined what the book is about. If people want to ask questions about the presidencies or about what's in the book, I'll be happy to
answer. Adrian, you described very well a civic society in free Ukraine. My question is, can there be any comments on the civic society in the occupied Ukraine? And I've asked this to other speakers, and everybody says, we don't know. I said, what is public opinion now in the occupied territories, and how do they feel about Russia? Because they've already been, the children at least have been now indoctrinated, and they're going to continue to be indoctrinated. And do we see any resistance at all in these occupied territories? Because I'm not seeing any.
Maybe Alex start to answer the question, and then I'll fill it in.
Well, we know from the past, the recent past, that civil society in the currently occupied territories was at best weak, at worst arguably non-existent. But let's just be generous and call it relatively weak. I mean, most of the activities that Adrian spoke about, the 2004 Orange Revolution, 2014 Maidan, the various movements that preceded those two major events in the late 1980s, 1990s, those happened in Kyiv, those happened in Western Ukraine, and then, of course, in various parts of Eastern Ukraine, Kharkiv, Poltava. But you'd be hard-pressed to find major activity in Luhansk. The Shevchenko Scientific Society had an office, used to have an office in Donetsk. And I remember I had visited it about 10 years ago. And it was just basically a guy with a bunch of brochures in a building in the center of town who bemoaned the fact that his books weren't selling, which isn't too surprising. Anyway, if that picture of civil society in the East is more or less accurate, then it could only have gotten worse in the last 10 or so years. I don't know, I haven't seen public opinion surveys. My guess is something along those lines has probably been done by Razumkov or one of the other public polling institutions in Ukraine. But how reliable they are, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine, again, from my point of view, that any self-respecting individual, even one that is inclined to be pro-Russian, pro-Putin, would survive these last 2.5 years in Donetsk, Luhansk, or any of the other occupied territories, and still remain enthusiastic about Russian rule. I can't imagine that. But then again, I can't imagine someone voting for Trump. And there you go. So, you know.
Well, I mean, look, we know from polling that was done around 2014 that the vast majority of people in the East wanted to remain a part of Ukraine. But 10 years of acculturation and occupation and repression and suppression, those people who show any patriotic sentiment are imprisoned. Victoria Roshchina, the journalist who actually was exposing FSB operations inside Ukraine, went to see her family in the East, and she was killed in captivity like a month ago. So that's the answer. We know the terror under which Kherson was, because those people who remained in Kherson were able to tell us. There are documentary films that tell how people who were activists were hiding and fearful and so on, and yet trying to communicate information anonymously about what was going on. There were people who were helping with targeting and so on, at great risk themselves. Well, the big thing that we know is what was the population shift after the Russian spring and the takeover of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast. And it was basically a 3-to-1 ratio. The people who wanted to leave, 1 out of every 4 went into Russia to get away from the criminal gangs that were there. And the rest of the people came into the heartland of Ukraine. So they voted 3-to-1. And the people who remained, there were people who had some jobs. There were some people who were sympathetic, could care less what country they were in. Some of them were recruited and were in the first waves so those 700,000 are former Ukrainians who died on the front. At least they were, registered as part of the Russian armies once these entities were incorporated into Russia. But Alex had mentioned, so I would say we kind of know where the people were. The people were more inclined to side with Ukraine, but the level of their courage, and we also know that many of the people who are fighting are people from what would be, I'm not sure statistically whether it's been determined, but the Russian language was widespread among the people who for the last 10 years have been fighting in the East. And many of the fiercest and most courageous people grew up in Russian-speaking environments and yet feel this deep sense of connection to defend Ukraine. So we kind of know, and we certainly know what the rest of Ukraine thinks about the country, even though there is fear among young people, partly because of a botched recruitment policy, fear from people, to do military service, and the level of enthusiasm to risk your life on the front has diminished somewhat, but not I wouldn't even say totally, but not even predominantly. But it's become a bit of a problem. But I think that's a separate issue, and I don't really want to go into it. But I do want to go back to one issue that you raised, and that is the Russian Constitution doesn't say that they absorbed the Khersonska Oblast of the state of Ukraine. It just says that they absorbed the Kherson Oblast. And since they have a very flexible idea of what the borders of another state are, do they have a flexible idea of what the border? I mean, if they have a piece of these countries, that I think there is no delineation. They didn't say which has, whatever it is on the, latitude and longitude. They didn't provide a map of what they were absorbing. And at the most, they might claim that Kherson, where they had the referendum, that is a territory. But much of the oblasts that are not occupied, first of all, there were no referenda there. Secondly, there's no specific designation, as far as I know. So there's flexibility. Anyway.
And then the gentleman.
I just, my question probably going beyond the book. First of all, I have to praise Adrian's book and I hope that more Americans would be able to read it. Because, for us who have Ukrainian roots or origin, many facts, we were following Ukrainian events minute by minute. So most of whatever is known to us, but it would be most important to bring that knowledge to the English-speaking population of United States. But my question to both of you actually, and especially in the sense what you said, you are optimist, Alex. You're optimist but not pessimist. But today in the morning, I saw the piece of your interview with BBC, where you look a little bit sad and with a grain of pessimism in your answers to the question of interviewer. Well, the interview was in Ukrainian, so that English-speaking people probably never would chance to hear it. But what the question? I'm sorry for that preliminary knowledge. Since moment of before, on the dawn of my immigration from the Soviet Union, I went to Kiev, and I didn't have much time, and I just wanted to catch a taxi. Doesn't matter that I was short of funds anyway. And I asked in Ukrainian, who is the last in the waiting line? And the guy who probably was the last turned to me and said, "Говори по-человечески." It's in the capital of Ukraine. Later on, after my immigration, I came in Ukraine in '92. I went to Independence Square. It was a different story. I mean, all was covered with Ukrainian flags and people were speaking Ukrainian with terrible Russian accent, most of them, but nevertheless, it was Ukrainian. And for me, I tried not to say anything myself because for me it was interesting to listen to that. And then next to me, some lost American was desperately asking if somebody speaks English. So I automatically changed to him at the start because he needed to get to the Lavra and he didn't know how to get it, but it was short walk, by the way. But why I'm telling about that episode, that people with whom I just was around and who was saying me and accepting me as a Ukrainian, obviously, that all of a sudden they went away. You know, it's me and my American compatriots happened to be standing alone, and around us was the space. So that Soviet side was there, still present. Even its independence and flags everywhere, for which it used to get 7 years imprisonment, you know, displaying Ukrainian flag. And when I went to Ukraine again a year later, and Kiev spoke Russian again, that the war, and especially starting in 1914 after annexation of Crimea and Donbass region, that Ukrainization started all over. It was just him sparkling and people start trying to speak Ukrainian, and more publications went and so on and so forth. But again, I'm jumping from the time. I just been to France. I was walking on the Paris street, and there was big group of people. In front of them, there was a female guide with the flying Ukrainian flag, and the group of people, most of them were speaking Russian to each other. And I asked one lady, "Where are you from?" She said, "From Ukraine." I said, "Why are you speaking Russian?" And I asked in Ukrainian, of course.
You asked the question.
Yeah. Okay. Now what I see, because I'm following whatever is going on, it seems certain tiredness of the war and some resentment and the theft of the government funds. Corruption is still tremendous in Ukraine. And the behavior of the current administration, of Ukrainian administration, of Greens, so-called, Zelensky's, they actually suppressing freedom of speech. Most of the independent Ukrainian sources are not allowed on the networks. Instead, they are fed with how they call it, I forgot it. That was common news. I'm not listening to it. That's why I don't remember. So that my question is, what your view, for Adrian and for Alex, what your view, what happened to Ukraine? Would Ukraine survive?
So I think that's the fundamental question. I mean, I think it's a done, there are two scenarios. One scenario is Ukraine survives, and then the other is Ukraine leaves. The Ukrainians leave. I think there would be a mass exodus if the front were to fall. The vast majority of people would not want to live under Russian occupation. There would be collapse, fear of basically totalitarian repression, which is, I think, the only way that Putin could reassert control and build his model of society. It's too late to do anything else. It's sort of like saying, what would the French do if the Germans marched in and said, "We're building Germany in France"? I think it's as deep, and it's not just linguistic. I think it's cultural. I mean, the attachment of Ukrainians to being able to speak freely and to do as they choose is very deeply ingrained. And partly it may have been that the state was not as strong, partly it was because of this hierarchy, but people like the space of freedom that they have had for 30 years with little dips up and down. But I think the Soviet mentality died. There are successive generations, and the generations that have come. I would, there are problems with this unified media space and the fact that there's no money going into media other than limited state money. But, Donald Trump was elected through X and podcasts. That's basically how he communicated with the rest of the world. The mass media in the United States were critical of him. They gave him some space, but it was always framed with commentary that was so I would say he was elected and he showed the way. In Ukraine, alternative media, people are watching things on YouTube. They're watching things unfortunately on Telegram, which is a Russian-controlled medium. And I think that they're watching on their iPhones or their smartphones, et cetera, et cetera. So the media environment is completely different, and internet, digital information, social networks, that's where communication comes, and the state is making no effort to try to steer it, control it, and so on. And as a result, I think the people are pretty aware of what is going on. On the question of morale, I think the morale is deeper than you suggest. I mean, there are many people. I mean, a lot of the people who left Ukraine, okay, women and so on, but if men left Ukraine, they were the less patriotically inclined, so they might be less connected to the Ukrainian language and so on. But I think that there's been a revival of Ukrainian speaking, and I think when you go to Kyiv today, you hear the predominance of the language you hear on the streets is Ukrainian, not Russian. And I think there have been inroads that have been made, cultural inroads and so on, and they stem from the Narodny Front forced on legislation that changed the TV space, that removed Russian language content from the airwaves, made it much harder without VPNs and through traditional cable broadcasting and normal broadcasting for Russian media to penetrate. That whole thing has gone away in the last 7 or 8 years. That also has had a fundamental effect. So I think things are generally right. The morale problem is, there is a thing like Russian roulette, and you're willing to do one roll of a gun that has a bullet in it, or 2 rolls. But if you're sitting in a ditch for 3 years, you're thinking that eventually it's going to get me. And the fact that they've not rotated people out makes the next group of people afraid to go, because there is a high death risk level from being forced to serve for 3 years on end. So the fact that they didn't rotate people out also created greater fear that I'm going to be stuck and no one's going to take me out. And I think they have to establish and make it clear that we're pulling people out as we're putting people in. We're going to ask you, you'll be sitting for a year and a half. We may ask you to come back, but to create a more balanced sense of risk. It is, people make calculations about, their own survival, and they can be heroic. But I think that's been a terrible mistake. And the fact that they're not recruiting 18 to 20, until recently, 27-year-olds and 18 to 27-year-olds, it's not understood by anyone in a Western society, and that was done for, I think, political expediency, because Zelensky didn't want to do something that was unpopular, and those have been policy mistakes. I don't think Ukrainian corruption is on the rise. I think it's diminished substantially, and you have to think about that. The Ukrainian economy is
still present.
Ukrainian economy is a state economy now. It was diversified. Most of the money is going through the state and then being pushed out back to the private sector. Think about how many billions of dollars of weapons and so on. There have been no major scandals on the use of weapons ending up in the wrong places. I like to, Alex knows this, I like to quote a famous article that was written during the Reagan administration that was called "Why We Need More Waste, Fraud, and Mismanagement in the Defense Budget." And his point was, if we're going to increase the defense budget by 20 or 25%, in the initial period, we're going to have $3,000 toilet seats, and we're going to have abuses, and we're going to have to clean them up. But the fact that Ukraine got all this stuff coming in, and there have been, modest scandals, and even all that stuff with Ukroboronprom and Gladkovsky in the Poroshenko era, it amounted to relatively minor proven cases of. So I think there, with all this money sloshing through the country from outside and all these weapons and resources and assistance, the fact that we haven't had this explosion of massive corruption. Yeah, there's some people who've gotten rich, and yeah, there are people who are taking money to give people deferments from the draft, and that should be prosecuted and punished. But I don't think Ukraine has moved in the wrong direction on corruption. I think to the contrary, it's handled it pretty well.
I'll try to be brief, if I may. Your first question about the the language. That was going to be my third, but if you insist. Look, think of the United States in the immediate, for the 100 years following the American Revolution. It was essentially a colony of British culture and language. It was only in the middle of the 20th century that American artists developed their own peculiar styles that were uninfluenced by those in Europe. Until the 1920s and 30s, where did Hemingway, where did Fitzgerald, where did the painters go? They went to Paris, they went to Berlin, they went to Europe. So it takes time. My point is to decolonize in terms of one's mentality, in terms of language and culture, simply takes time. Look at West Germany and Germany more generally. East Germany has now been part of West Germany since 1989. This is a good 35 years. For the initial 10, 15 years, West Germany was pumping in something like $100 billion a year. It was fantastic amounts of money that modernized and completely transformed the East German economy. And what do you have? 35 years later, they're voting for the wrong side. They're still authoritarian, they're still pro-Russian. They shouldn't be. There's no basis in reality for those sorts of feelings. And yet the alternative for Germany is getting somewhere like 20 to 25% of the total vote, and something like 30 to 40 in East Germany proper. So these things take time. And we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that they also take time in Ukraine. What you see in Ukraine is that with each crisis, the revolution on the cement, as it was called, then granite, excuse me, right. Then you had independence, then you had the Orange Revolution, the Maidan, and everything in between. There's always a certain percentage of the population that experiences a significant shift in its attitudes towards Ukraine and Ukrainian identity, likewise a shift in terms of language and things like that. Volodymyr Kulik, he's a professor at the newly founded School of Business that's led by Milovanov. He does significant research on this, and he's shown that there's been a significant shift in attitudes towards Ukrainian language, culture, sovereignty, and everything else. Statistically, he's also done those little groups, so he's covered all of his bases empirically. So it takes time. That's my basic point. With regard to democracy, Ukraine is fighting a war. Every country that is fighting a war experiences a centralization of authority. There ain't no other way. It's just the way it was. I mean, the ancient Romans recognized this by appointing an individual as a dictator for a period of time. War ended, then the dictator went back to his farm. But this is just in the nature of the beast. Now, that means that there may be a problem after the war ends. Whoever happens to be in power at that point will be used to having more say. Will those attitudes be curbed by the existing institutions? Will civil society play a role in curbing those sorts of attitudes? If you agree with Adrian, and I do, the answer is yes, in all likelihood, yes. Maybe not immediately, but certainly within a relatively short period of time. The following point, will Ukraine survive? Absolutely. I have no doubt that there will be a Ukrainian state and a Ukrainian nation 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. It may be smaller than we would like it to be. It may not contain the territories that are currently occupied by Russia. It may not contain all of the territories currently occupied by Russia. But I don't doubt that Ukraine will survive for a very simple reason. Two reasons. One is the ones that Adrian has been mentioning. Ukrainian resilience, the formation of a national identity, the strength of the state and things of that sort. Absolutely very important. We need to keep that in mind. But the flip side of the coin is Russia lacks the resources. The best Russia can do is go hat in hand to North Korea. Imagine if the United States invaded Mexico and after 2.5 years lost 20% of the territory, or 50% of the territory that initially had, right? Is forced to use tanks from World War II, because the Mexicans have destroyed 7,000 or 8,000 of them, and then turns to the Canadians for assistance. We would call that a smashing defeat for the Americans. So there is no basis for saying that the Russians are winning. They don't have the resources. You cannot capture Ukraine with what are the T-52 tanks from 1945. It's just not going to happen. Time, in other words, is actually on Ukraine's side. I wonder whether Trump realizes that. I wish he does. I wish the Ukrainians do too. I don't think Putin believes it, but that's another matter altogether.
I have a question from online if you guys would. Okay.
Well, let's just go to this gentleman.
Danuki L, the Knyaz of Cats, asks, thank you for your presentation. How would you evaluate the partisan movements like Atesh operating in currently occupied territories? And Atesh is the Crimean Tatar group.
Could you repeat the question?
Well, how would one evaluate the Crimean Tatar resistance movement, Natesh? There are several others
Several other partisans in different parts.
in different parts of the occupied territories, especially in Melitopol. If you look at the maps of deep states, that's always in pink as opposed to red. Look, it's these movements. Some of them are large, some of them are small. Have been in existence since February 24, 2022. And it's not surprising. You know, the occasional bomb explosions. I mean, just yesterday, a Russian general was killed. Now, I'm assuming the Ukrainian intelligence people had some hand in that, but at some point, to some degree, local talent has to be involved. Whether it's Atesh or whether it's other people, clearly this is testimony to the fact that inhabitants of the occupied territories, some inhabitants of the occupied territories, are willing to take significant chances. Because of course they realize full well that being captured means immediate imprisonment and possibly death. So that testifies to the fact that there is some resistance. How widespread, we don't know. Put yourself in the position of someone living in Luhansk or Donetsk. I mean, you may not be too enthused by Ukraine and sovereignty and things like that, but assuming that you do want to resist in some fashion or other, how exactly do you do it? Whom do you talk to? Do you trust your friends? Do you trust your relatives? Do you even trust your spouse? We know from the East German experiences that isn't necessarily a smart move. So organizing anything is complicated. And the same holds true for the Russians. Something like 15,000 have apparently been imprisoned for various kinds of activities. That's not completely unimpressive. We'd like it to be 140,000 testifying to their the mass nature of the protest movement, but nevertheless, there is a movement of some kind, however small. But of course, in the occupied territories, as in Russia proper, there is the fear of retaliation and of oppression. And one can appreciate why people are reluctant to put their lives on the line. So when they do, it's all the more impressive. So Atesh clearly testifies to resistance, but it also testifies to resistance by Crimean Tatars. Because come what may, they will play a greater role in whatever configuration of Ukraine that emerges from the war.
Could I have one small question, very specific? Last Thursday, Volker had an interview on a Ukrainian TV channel. I don't remember which channel. It was quite extensive. And he, of course, was talking about the effect of electing Trump for Ukraine. And he suggested that he would recommend Biden in the last 2 months that he still has the power to allow Ukraine to use the long-range missiles. Now, what is your opinion about this, and would it make a difference?
Yes, of course it would make a difference. I doubt if Biden will do this. He's been extremely cautious, and I think given his, I think he will not try to put Trump in some kind of a condition or set of relations that as an incoming president, I think it's completely against the low risk approach he's taken. I think we all know the famous quote from General Austin in his phone conversation with Serhiy Shoigu, telling him, "We're not allowing the Ukrainians to do this, this, and that. If you use nuclear weapons, we'll let them loose." Well, that's ridiculous. They tied Ukraine with one hand behind its back to fight the war. But the fact is that if there is no successful negotiation or settlement, the only way to get Putin to wind down the war would be to take out the power grid in Moscow and in major Russian cities. And that can be done by long-range missiles fired from Sumska Oblast, Storm Shadows, and other weapons that I think right now are being delayed by Britain because they themselves have a shortage of them, allegedly. But long-range missiles, and maybe the long-range missiles that Ukraine is developing but have not been fully tested and have not passed their tests, but Ukraine will soon have those kinds of missiles as well in the midterm. That is the way to bring this war to an end, because if the misery is felt in the population and the economic effects, where 25% of the Russian GDP is in Moscow Oblast and large missile manufacturing plants and so on, if in the middle of winter you can create a mass exodus because there's no heat and hot water. There are 30 non-nuclear power plants around Moscow that feed the city. If they were targeted, they could be a game changer. But I don't think Biden has the risk on, and certainly there would be some discussion with the Trump team, and I'm sure they would not be willing to, They're going to try to go the diplomatic path, and they'd like to keep maybe that's an option for the longer term, and that certainly is an option. And I would say if negotiations fail, that may be an option that they would consider.
One more question.
So just to end this on a positive note, warning, I mean, not really. It's a very pessimistic note. So I completely agree that Ukraine will survive, and I don't think there will be a collapse of the front, or that the front will move too much farther from where it is. At the same time, I'm finding it difficult to accept this view that Ukraine is not losing. And I'm not the only one saying this, but two facets. One is there's negative factors for Ukraine. I don't think you're emphasizing enough, and the largest of these would probably be the conscription crisis. So we know that topic. But more important is just the framing. It seems to me unlikely that the regime, ever intended to take the entire territory of Ukraine. It seems their goal was some version of Novorossiya. And it seems that in order to, quote, win, Putin just needs to look like he's not losing. And that means hold on to what he has, establish, clearly momentum in his direction, and have that as, his chips on the table for, when the new regime in the United States, that's not fair, when the new administration in the United States takes over. So the question is, if I'm completely out to lunch here, please tell me that I am. Thank you.
I would frame it somewhat differently. I mean, I think that the question Ukraine has to face is, if there is a protracted war, I think there will be this will have longer term consequences for the Ukrainianness of the country that remains, because the longer it goes on, many fewer people who have left the country will want to return. They'll become more integrated. They'll develop individual and personal relationships, and maybe start building new lives here. And it'll be very hard for those who had originally intended to return. Secondly, there will be a further exodus. And then there will be the attrition and the loss of lives in the recapturing of these territories. So these are hard questions. But I don't think that, if the front is stable, we know that a war of attrition over 20 years would be would be to Ukraine's detriment much more so than to Russia's, except in one sense, that if Russia's elite believes it should be a major power, it will not be a major power if it continues to be subject to the sanction regime, the loss of resources, and the consequences that will have to Russia falling further and further behind. I mean, the AI revolution, I don't want to over-exaggerate it, but it cannot be over-exaggerated. Russia will be left out of that AI revolution. It already is. It's lost many of its programmers, have been talented people who are in places like Dubai and Belgrade. I think that has to be calculated by that elite. So even though there is a problem for Ukraine of fighting a very long-range, slow-moving and deadly conflict, I think there is an equal problem in Russia, but I think that problem gets solved more quickly if Ukraine has long-range capabilities to disrupt Russian power and the Russian economy. So I think there is an answer apart from a negotiated settlement early on. There is an answer that is not as pessimistic as you would suggest.
See, you said Russia wins if it's not losing. I would reverse that and say Putin loses unless he's winning. One can claim, well, he's got this mighty propaganda apparatus. You can frame the narrative any way he likes. And to some degree, of course, that's true. But we do know, Adrian's statistics show this, we know this from other sources, that a significant portion of Russians is unhappy, is feeling the effects of the war. But again, as I said before, I'm not sure the Russians really matter. They will matter, the mass of Russians will matter if and when there's some kind of breakdown or elite conflict. That elite conflict is already taking place. Putin's position is far less strong, far more brittle than he lets on. You look at him and he just exudes bravado. This is a guy who barely survived remember in June of 2023, the mutiny, as it's called, the coup d'etat, as I prefer to call it, run by Yevgeny Prigozhin. This is a man who is openly criticized by the economic elite. There was a recent debate within the corridors of power in Russia between the head of the central bank, who insisted that 21% as the lending rate, the what's that called? The borrowing rate, right? This is the minimum, that it might actually go up to 23, 24. a man by the name of Chemizov, who runs a significant portion of the military industries, was saying, if you keep this up, we will all go bankrupt. Another fellow by the name of, he's the Minister of Finance, implied very clearly, I mean, not just implied, he stated very clearly that the reason for these troubles is because there's out of control spending in the military sector. The Russians know that they're in trouble. They know they're in trouble, and they know who brought this about. It's Putin.
But all they need is a deal from Trump, and then they're good. I mean, the
Possibly.
regime's position is
Conceivably, or alternatively, Putin insists on keeping the territories he's occupied, plus those that he aspires to occupy. Trump goes ballistic, and who knows? I mean, at this point, this is pure speculation. I have no idea. But the point is, it's important to remember that Putin's position is weak. He's not the strong man that he claims to be. He's actually quite weak. And he needs to project strength. He needs a victory. Alternatively, if he doesn't get that, it's a defeat. Now, what that means with Trump is, of course, another issue. We've been sort of discussing it and dancing around it, so we'll see what happens. Anyway.
So I think we're concluding, but I want to make just one point referring to Oles's discussion of his visit to the Donetsk affiliate of Entesha, with a guy lamenting that he couldn't sell any books. Let's make sure that the New York Entesha doesn't have the same kind of lament. So I'm happy to sign books at the end of this discussion, and thank you for your great questions.
Thank you both. That wraps up the Q&A.